All right. Train of Thought podcast of Biblical Christ Research Institute. And today I'm joined by my brothers in Christ, Eric Powers and Deron Gladden. Shout out to Mike Lowry, Mike Wellen, and Matt Lawrence in their absence. Hope to see you guys next week. We'll make sure you get a copy of this once it's posted. So we're going to continue our journey through the scriptures. Of course, we started off in Genesis, and we're going to work our way to Revelation, however long that takes. And we've already done the first 2 days, so today we're going to cover 3 and 4, maybe get into 5. We'll see how far we get, but we appreciate you guys watching this and going on this journey with us, and hope that we are doing justice to the text, making it clear, rightly dividing it, so that you all that are watching can be edified and learn, uh, maybe learn some things you didn't know, or solidify some things that you already knew, and build on those things. So we're going to start in verse 9. And as always, we read from the New American Standard. This is 1995 paragraph version. She says, then God said, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth, bearing fruit after their kind, with seed in them. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, the third day. Right. So getting into these texts again, we've completed the first 2 days. We get into day 3, and God is, as we established, God is causing a separation uh, between the dry land and the waters. So my question is this: so we can see in the text that this basically comes from his speaking, um, the action there. He
Mhm.
himself says, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear," and it was so. And we know from the earlier verses that originally the earth was covered with water. Um, Now I was driving. It's interesting because I actually thought about this on the way back from Utah, and I was driving, and I was wondering. You guys could, and feel free to share your thoughts on this, but I was just wondering, since the earth was covered with water at first, and then he speaks and says it tells it to separate, and then the dry land appears. And I'm looking at the mountains in Utah on the way back, and I was like, well, how did in my mind, I'm like, how did that is that from the receding water, or is that from um because nowhere in the text does it say anything about the mountains being uh
Yeah,
produced.
I
So
think.
I
Yeah,
wanted to get you guys thoughts on where the different mountainous regions came from.
yeah. I hold the view that I think a lot of that came from the catastrophism of the global flood and rising and lowering of the topography of the Earth with the tectonic plates shifting and moving, and that catastrophism that was a global event. With what we see in Genesis 6 through 9. So I think at this point here in day 3, God's preparing a place for man to be able to inhabit. Because it's parallel. Day 3 is kind of parallel to day 6. So you have the land appearing. He's providing that environment then for man to be able to occupy and to inhabit, basically. Whereas those mountains, the massive scale of all the mountains across the earth, that we see, like the different mountain forms and things. I think that happened because of the global flood and the catastrophism, that global event with Noah's flood. And that's the view that I hold with mountain formations and whatnot.
Makes sense. Anything to add,
Yeah,
Duran?
yeah, I would strongly agree. You know, I think one has to consider that the Earth itself at the time of the creation event, it looks a lot different than it does, post fall and even post flood. So you have this constant, change that's taking place, kind of a degeneration away from the 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 good creation, so to speak. I mean, it still has its features as we see it, but yeah, those changes, those mountain ridges, I would even say like weather patterns, things like that have changed significantly
There's a
from the
flood.
time of God's creation because of
Yeah.
the flood.
Is it
So there's
geophysical properties of the Earth? But I don't know. I mean, here, Chris and Duran, when you get to day three,
yeah,
whether mountains are involved or not, I can't speak to that because I don't.
Yeah,
Just,
that's what I was wondering.
yeah,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
a good
yeah,
question. But certainly the way that the appearance of age and the massive scale of like the Andes, the Himalayas, the Rockies, massive mountain structures. Those certainly, the way it is today, is evidence of the catastrophism and the rising of and falling of the earth. When we had a global flood,
yeah,
but it's likely that you have mountains here too. I'm just not sure because it doesn't say
Yeah.
in the text. But when he's separating the land from the waters, obviously, you're having different. The continents are available, and you have lakes and whatnot. So there's got to be some sort of topography. I
yeah,
just don't know what the scale is at this point.
Which is a good answer because we don't want to, over speculate on the text.
Speculate, right?
You
yeah.
know, I mean, the question came about because I was looking at some mountain range that was kind of close to the highway, and it had some discolorations as if, like, I don't know if you guys have been to Lake Mead lately, but you can see where the water line used to be.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of these mountain formations, they actually had that same kind of line, and it got me to thinking about the question, like, where the mountains were they there? Um,
So, yeah.
was it irregular from the beginning, or
Yeah, I definitely think at worst it's a combination because Noah's family knows what to look for when the waters recede,
Mm-hmm.
and then but there's
That's good.
also a sense in which, like Eric said, like the scale. I mean, like that's hard to really say because that scale is kind of not as defined. I do believe there have been like archaeology discoveries, and we can even talk about it off air, but there's been some where I think the scale of, and obviously we know this just by the giants and the things, and I think that there were things on Earth at the time of creation that were much larger than they are now. And, with respect to persons, with respect to an untampered with creation that is yet to feel the devastating effects of the fall immediately. So I think those things are in play, but that doesn't necessarily say that mountains were, a lot larger and things like that. I think in everything we're looking at, though, you do see evidence of the global flood, like receding waters.
And the
Uh,
appearance
you
of
know, you,
age with the mountains,
yeah, absolutely.
coloration.
Yeah, I mean, I used to live in the desert for the last couple years, and I mean, you can see sand and sand dunes, and I used to always tell my kids, if you walk out deep enough, you'll find seashells, you'll find evidence of amphibious life out there in the desert. So I think those are features, but that catastrophe was so much so it can't be on the scale of our mind. I don't know that we can even account for it because it's a world that we haven't laid our eyes on.
right,
Um,
right?
I think there's definitely different continents and not one super continent
Yeah, the
because he
Pangea.
Yeah, like no
Pangea,
Pangea. Yeah,
yeah, and you have like things rising and caving in versus continents breaking apart and floating. So
Yeah.
Pangea explanation really doesn't make any sense scientifically, but I see the it's very likely that you have you're looking at the text. It's very likely that you have multiple continents because he uses seas plural. There's multiple seas, so that might suggest, I think, multiple continents.
Yeah.
Where he creates, when he created the dry land. So I think that's an interesting exegetical observation there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just I was like coming back. I was like, yeah, I'm gonna ask the guys about that.
Because that
See,
would also suggest like a topography in the land, but I just don't know what the scale is as compared to the catastrophism of the global flood. Because what we see
right,
now definitely has the evidence. The Earth has the mountains have evidence of age because of the whole Earth was drowned with water, and just the impact that made.
Yeah.
And that's what we observe today. We see what's left over from that.
right,
But
right.
that's a really good question.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately,
what was
it's
the
not.
scale and height of these mountains?
Yeah, ultimately, it's not the necessary the point of the text, but it is something to
Yeah, it's
think
definitely
about
something to think about.
and
Yeah,
consider.
I
I
thought the
mean,
same thing. I took a trip to the Northwest, and Chris, I thought the same thing when you drive, you drive the Pacific Coast Highway, you see the redwoods,
yeah,
and I
yeah,
mean
yeah,
these things are, I mean, they
massive.
are the giants, and so but you're thinking about the scale. Like trees now don't really look like that, and so there
Right.
is a scale I think that's unaccounted for. I mean, it's accounted for because it's there, but it's unaccounted for if you try to do too much of a comparison. It's just very hard to.
Would you
But
say
I
that?
agree.
Would you say that's a cause of entropy?
The size and scope of them,
Right.
it's hard to say. That's a great question. Oh, it's one of those rare situations where I don't know that I have a ready answer. I mean, well, let me put it this way: I definitely believe it is, but then to what degree?
Yes,
Right.
Like, are you
Right.
looking
Right.
at
Right.
something that was bigger than it was, and now it's not?
well,
You know,
certainly entropy is about using up energy,
Mhm.
right,
and you run out of energy in
right,
thermodynamics with the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy, and so
yes,
those giant trees have a it's now a deterministic amount of energy that you use up, and when it's gone, it's
yeah.
gone.
So they're not growing per se, and that's what I mean by with entropy.
Mhm.
Am I looking at something that was perhaps a little bit larger than what it is today?
Yeah,
And am I looking at it kind of shrinking down in size? I think
Right.
that would be my only question.
Yeah, that's what made me think about it when you talked about
Hmm.
because they used to be massive and now suddenly they're
Yeah, so I agree with Eric. I definitely would say it is. Like, the thing I would say I don't have a ready answer for is like the
yeah.
scale. Like, am I looking at something that was
well, yeah.
perhaps a little bit larger
Mhm.
at a time, and now it's, I
Yeah,
mean,
oh,
it's
I
the
mean,
same
well,
thing with lifespans and everything else.
yeah, and the Bible doesn't get into specificity of the scale of how it reduced or anything like that. But
No, not particularly.
there's still good questions to visit, as long as you're not, again, over speculating
I
on the
will say
text.
this. Yeah, I will say this. I do believe that there was whatever there existed pre-flood, there was more of it at man's disposal because even as
Yeah,
Noah is
yeah,
building
I
the
agree
ark,
with that.
I mean, he's gathering massive amounts of gopher wood that is not only available, but now obviously there's a miraculous and divine, you know, omnipotence to it, the all powerful nature of God involved, and this is a miracle in the sense of bringing him into the ark and bringing him to build it. And but my point is the resources available. It's on a scale that's not like something that we would necessarily consider what we have today because that no one can duplicate that particular arc being built in that way by that
Right,
construction.
right.
So
Well, thank you for your thoughts, gentlemen. Um, let's move on to the vegetation here. Um, so he says in verse 11, then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation." Um, I, Duran and I were talking about the NET notes.
Hmm.
Yeah, those have been very helpful, um, to kind of
Hmm.
spur me to think about the text exegetically. And so, from the notes, it says that the word deshe, which is translated vegetation there, normally it means grass, but um, in this text, because of what comes after it, it's talking about the general vegetation as a whole. Um,
Yeah.
so because when you get to verse 11, it says, "Let the earth sprout vegetation." So vegetation would be like the general statement, but then he gets a little more specific
Yeah.
right after that when he talks about plants yielding seed and
Hmm.
fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them. So
Yeah.
Right.
so I
So like
thought,
the self germination kind of process that's
right,
built
right,
into the vegetation. Yeah.
right, because in there because the trees and the plants are fruitful, uh in that manner that you just mentioned, that self germinating, like when the
Yeah.
seed falls and it goes into the ground, and then another tree grows, and
Seed time and harvest and all those
right,
principles
right,
that God set forward.
right,
Yeah, and I mean, and I would say that is definitely in play because of the intent. The intention of God's good creation and how it's supposed to be used. It's supposed to be used in a way that His creatures are going to consume what they need. Man and woman are going to consume what they need and their posterity. So, I think there's a functional element to this vegetation where there's no uselessness. Uh, I think weeds. It's funny, Eric and we talked about it when I was out there visiting, and just how devastating weeds are. I don't know if you remember us having that
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah. In
We were looking
turf
at some weeds.
particularly,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And
It's very
that is
useful.
very much post fall. I mean, a post fall
Yes.
yeah, I
consequence.
was just about to ask you that.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
absolutely.
that's a post fall consequence.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because you have all this plant life and the different kinds of plant life or kinds of vegetation, trees and plants, grass. You everything was created fully grown and mature,
Hmm.
and so this didn't come through processes of evolution or and there's no death and decay, and so you don't have entropy either. This is just God is creating here, and there's life, and it's increasing. The life is increasing, and he's declaring it very good. And when you think about weeds, definitely a product of the fall because they choke out. And particularly, I can speak to the turf because that's what I did for a living for a while was turf restoration and care and herbicides um, and fertilizer. And so the turf weeds just wreak havoc. And so you have to aerate. If you want proper turf, fescue we have in Maryland here is actually comes from Europe, so it's not native to the East Coast. But fescue does well in this climate and this time of year. I mean, you need irrigation, you need herbicide, you need to aerate in the fall and the spring, or the soil becomes compact and these weeds thrive in the soil and just annihilate the grass.
Mm-hmm.
And weeds can have harmful effects on other plants in your garden and whatnot. So I have to agree, Duran, it's definitely a product of the fall.
Hmm.
These weeds
Absolutely.
and whatnot.
Yeah, and that's why I think you see form and function so close together in this early Genesis account because everything is good, everything is perfect, and
Right.
everything is meant to be used and consumed and replenished. It will be replenished, absent of the events that are going to take place concerning the fall.
Yeah, and the labor it takes too to actually deal with weeds
Hmm.
and harmful flora post
Hmm.
fall is actually we see that from the text in Genesis 3. He's
Yep.
talking about the labor that Adam's going to have to do
hmm
post
Yep.
fall.
sweating your
Thorns and
brow. Yeah.
thorns and thistles will produce for you. Because
Yep.
God curses the ground on account of Adam's sin.
Yep.
So then, would you say the cultivation the cultivation that was originally supposed to take place was far easier
Oh yeah, I mean it was
Absolutely,
perfect.
yeah,
than the
It was
post fall.
absolutely.
perfect harmony between man and flora, because Adam was God's representative in the garden, but also to keep the garden and to till it, and to take care of the trees and the flora in the
Yeah,
garden.
yeah. Like I
So he's a
picture,
steward over the
like
garden, and it
yeah,
was
I
a
was getting ready to use that word.
yeah,
I picture
stewardship.
how it looks in finance, like when you're managing resources or someone's financial accounts, like your job is to just see to it that those things are allocated in a proper way, as opposed to I need to wrestle against unstoppable forces that are trying to take away the
Yeah,
very thing that I'm given. That
there's no
doesn't happen until the post fall.
exactly. There's no conflict. I mean, it's
Yeah.
perfect harmony between man and flora, and there's no poison. I just got poison ivy the other day because I had to do a job where I had to remove some vines of poison ivy off of a house, and the
Mm,
effect that has on me right now is something that is post fall. With you have,
yeah.
I think in Hosea, he says poisonous weeds grow up in the furrows of the field, and so you
Mm,
have hemlock,
Mhm.
looks like carrots, looks like parsley. If you eat it, it's deadly, and that
Mhm.
and part of the judgment that God was, you know, in the rebellion of Israel in the temporal sense, was having these poisonous weeds grow
yep.
up in the furrows of the fields. The furrows where they till for their food, and you have some of these deadly flora, poisonous plants that resemble the same, that look the same way as some of the agriculture that Israel is producing.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I believe that's a great point. I believe that's also why this is where it is in the Pentateuch or in the Torah, because all that you just said, Eric, is what the Israelites have to understand as they are about to inherit the promised land. The promised land is a promised land with God's divine blessing, but it is still part of a fallen world. And so
Yeah,
there's some rules and laws and things that they need to know where things began, the source of things, but they also need to, functionally, they're going to have a role that's greater than Adam's in terms of exercising a certain dominion over things that are now fighting back. So I think it's very important.
You mentioned hemlock. Wasn't that what Socrates was poisoned
yeah,
by?
he was
Mhm.
publicly executed. The whatever trial they put him through, and then they actually forced him to drink the hemlock, the poison from the hemlock. Here in America, we have water hemlock, and it's in the same category or class. I don't know, however, the scientists, the jargon they use to classify flora, but it's in the same family as I think parsley, and it looks, underneath the ground looks like carrots, but the top part of it looks like parsley.
Hmm.
Mm, that's crazy. That's crazy. Yeah, I think about
Uh,
that. I think about allergens, all that stuff. I mean, it's all
Right, right,
post
right.
fall. That's not happening in the early Genesis
So it's
account.
either in the same classification as carrots or parsley. I'm not sure, but a lot of people have mistaken it for something that's edible and have eaten hemlock, and it has this chemical reaction in you where you don't want to eat anything else, and you keep returning back to that particular plant
Hmm.
until you die. So animals too, like uh, beasts of burden, domestic, beasts like cattle and stuff, have mistakenly eaten hemlock and died too.
Wow.
And that's
It's
we have
crazy.
we have water hemlock in North America, which is not as poisonous as I think with Socrates, in Europe, in Greece, that he was forced to drink in his public execution. But yeah, that's the plant and poison that he definitely suffered through. That they made him drink in his public execution.
Ish.
Wow.
Hemlock. So that's all.
Man,
That all happened because of um,
it's
God
post fall.
cursing the ground because of Adam's sin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It says curses the ground because of you. So he cursed the ground.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And so the reaction of my skin to the chemical reaction of my skin to poison ivy is a result of the fact that it's the ground that was cursed, and you have these poisonous plants now growing up. That was not the case here in the creation week.
No, and
Uh,
I'm glad that you're talking about it that way, because a lot of people don't think about it as, okay, this is a result of the fall. This is post fall. People don't think like, oh, Christians, they don't think like that. So I think it's very helpful.
yeah, we're used to the way things are now, and we
Right.
can't see through this veil. Or what you're saying is a lot of people can't see through the veil because they choose not to, because they are just comfortable and accept what is now and what they
Right.
actually can see with their physical eyes. But we believe with the eyes of our understanding because we believe what God said and we take him at his word. And this is before he cursed the ground because of Adam's sin.
And then even in the account, I've studied and have taught through the account of Cain and Abel. There is, yes, the ground is at that point cursed. It is a fallen humanity now, but
Mm,
to a larger degree, he then deals with what Cain has done. He
mm,
curses Cain's, uh, you know, as someone who's going to be very futile in his endeavor to be what he is, and that's he has an expertise in livestock and
yeah,
and all the trades that go with that. But he, to a larger degree, he says now your efforts will be cursed, and that is when one
Even
sows
more.
blood. When one sows blood into the ground, there's a further built-in curse,
mm,
and we know that is murder. I mean, that's when
Hmm.
murder is committed. In the God's reciprocating justice against that itself. But that's in that account. I know we're going to get there, but I
Yeah.
found that to be fascinating as well. That when you sow blood into the ground uh, on murder, then there's a certain resistance in
Mhm.
Cain's account that will break forward in his life.
Yeah.
So
So there's a specific phrase here, and it repeats later on in chapter one. And it is verse 11. Um,
mhm.
the Lexham English translation says according to their kind.
mm,
Here in the NESB it says after their kind. Um, but I really wanted to zoom in on that because it it's actually a very helpful argument to the all the things that are going on in society today, which of course we're not going to get into it. But if people would understand what this phrase meant, um, then they would understand how when all of these social issues come up in reference to pronouns and letters and things like that, then you can go back to creation and argue from there. Because this phrase is very important because God, he says, according to their kind, what that phrase means is that God is making distinctions,
yeah,
and not not
Yeah,
just on not just on the macro level, but also on the micro level. Because we
yeah,
talked about this, I taught this in my Sunday class, and you know, it kind of got a little slightly tense, but
mm,
um, where I was explaining, an apple tree is always going to be an apple tree.
mm-hmm,
A dog is always going to be a dog. Cat's always going to be a cat. A male is always going to be a male, and female is always going to be a female, and so on and so forth. That's what that phrase means. So, whatever order to creation God has established in reference to the trees, the plants, the animals, humans, that's what they're always going to be.
right,
yeah,
Um, Even on a micro level, because the guy brought up, I was talking about the apples, and he said, "Well, what about man? Grafting." I said, "Well, that's man trying to make changes, but it shows the futility. I mean, it's good that man can cultivate and make different types of apples, but ultimately,
he's got to manipulate. He's got to manipulate the system,
right,
uh, the natural system that's already there, cross pollination or whatever. Um, like you said.
which brings about mutation.
Yeah,
I mean,
that has
typically,
to be
which
manipulated.
brings about mutation.
Yeah,
I mean,
that has to
typically
be
the
manipulated
consequence is
by
mutation.
But
Yeah.
even here,
the environment.
here's even the futility of that, because we started talking about apples, because well, I eat a lot of apples, so that's why I use and I know all the different varieties. I'm like, well, a Fuji apple's never going to be a Gala apple, and a Gala apple's never going to be a Granny Smith, and a Granny Smith is never going to be a Washington. So it doesn't matter how much man tries to make these changes, whether they're large or small. This, according to their kind, is always going to stick there and say,
Yeah, you said something, Chris, that I agree that certainly here in the text with the after the kind, it goes against macroevolution 100% in the plant world. It's an argument because you're not going to have plants evolve into oak trees or dogwoods. If you have a Nandina domestic plant, it can't become a dogwood tree. And I have some crotons, my favorite kind of shrub, the croton. It's a tropical shrub that's never going to become. It can't evolve into a dogwood. There's also have a dogwood around the crotons outside right now, and they can't evolve into a dogwood. So certainly against macroevolution, and I'll even say microevolution, it doesn't exist and is, you know, denied by what is clearly laid out here when he talks about after their kind and the seed and whatnot.
yeah. And
Yeah.
so, I mentioned that in class. I'm like, I'm not going to get into the whole social issue, but if you explain this phrase, there's nowhere that, when you put that phrase and explain it as we're explaining it,
Mm-hmm.
and you put that in front of that person, there's nowhere they can go to argue outside of that, because this is God. God is establishing what this kind is going to be, this kind, that kind is going to be that kind, that's kind, and it's not going to change.
Yeah,
Right.
So
and you have a few things that are happening as that works itself into the social component. Is you have people mistaking, species and kind. They typically redefine either of the two, or they get them mixed up. Where you're looking at species and you're considering them to be kinds, and people typically, and some just have questions about it, even with respect to the Noah's Ark. How did all I always get the question? How did all those species of animals fit on the ark? And I say it wasn't all the species of animals; it was the kind. It was according to their kinds. And I want to make another point when you talk about adaptation, even with humans. Like at one point in my life, if you threw me in water, I was probably going to drown. I didn't know how to swim. And at some other point in my life, if you throw me in water, I'm going to know how to swim because I practice. You adapt to your setting. But my point is that doesn't change my essential form and function.
right,
So I don't cease to be a male who can learn how to swim. I don't cease to be a human being. I haven't developed any new properties. I still have the same digits. I have the
yeah, you
same
don't you don't have
arms,
you
same
don't have
legs.
webs in between
Right.
fingers.
So adaptation doesn't always, or let me put it this way, not that it doesn't always, it never signifies a change in form and function.
Right.
And so people want to make that the case, and then you get into pulling them into this existential, experiential realm of feeling, whereby now you're the standard of redefining what change is, and therefore redefining what kinds and species exist and how they can evolve.
And
And that's where we are today.
yeah, exactly. I'd agree with that. I think also there's you got to make the distinction between what we have here with reproduction versus
Yeah.
mutation. Mutation being
Yes.
something post fall having to do with thermodynamics and entropy, whereas here you have perfect harmony and reproduction.
Yes.
And so you have to believe. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. You have to
Right.
believe that this is a creation week where there is no sin, there is no decay, there is no entropy in this reproduction process. There's no mutations. as it is post fall, and no one's manipulating. A man's not manipulating this process with mutations. Like people breed. Well, we're going to get there. I think eventually, probably going to ask this question when it comes to canine breeding, but here cross pollination and but even when you're doing that here with mutations, you're still taking shrubs together or grass together, but grass will never become a tree, and grass will never become shrubs. They can't evolve. They didn't evolve as such. And all this didn't evolve from rocks, and rocks can't evolve. So the uniformitarianism and the macro and microevolution are really just attempts of historical denialism of the Genesis account here, creating a different answer, a different meta narrative to origins. Whereas there's only one correct story to origins, historical narrative to origins, and that's what we see here in Genesis chapter 1, the creation week.
Absolutely, yeah, and I know we're also going to get to God created them male and female a little bit further down into the text, but I just think when I think one of the major things, and it is huge in state-centered education objectives, because they're pushing it the most in the name of academics and science. But you also see it being pushed throughout society at large. And this idea of fluidity and people being able to choose what they think they are based on feeling and based on existential experience. My answer to that is that the problem that I have with that is everything in the creation week, as Eric said, is related to form and function. And so even when male and female are created, male, he has a form and he has a function. And we'll get into what that is. Same with female, form and function. And it's not up to them because it's given to them, it's designated to them. It's not up to them to say, well, I believe that I should have been a dog or a cat, or you swap the two essential and only exclusive genders that exist. My point is, with all that, with everything that God creates, it has form and function, and that is how you interpret what really is. So, by manipulating and changing that, it doesn't become something else. You are what you are. You just manipulated and tried to change it, but you essentially you are what you are. Mm-hmm. And I think starting from there is, like Eric said, you only get there by faith, because a lot of people call this hate speech, hate speaking, regressive thought, but the issue at hand is everything that's created is form and function. It's form and function. And God creates something and gives it its designated function to perform, and within that scope, it performs the way that God intended it to, and that gets the creation and creatures all the way up the line to humankind.
Yeah, I just think it was really important for us to. I was looking forward to getting to that little phrase because it's been glossed over so much.
Yeah.
Now, I think it was just very important to kind of zoom in on that for a few minutes to help people to understand it. It's God who is making the distinctions between these plants and these trees. And eventually, when we get to day 6, the dogs, the cats, the cows, the horses, so on and so forth. That's coming from his speech.
And the consistency, because let's put it in its literal historical grammatical setting. Moses, I believe he's speaking to the soon-to-be Israelites, people of Israel on the plains of Moab, and they're to consider the consistency with which the creation should operate as they inherit the promised land and as they carry out God's divine purposes as interpreted through the covenants. And so there was an expectation of consistency. You're not supposed to change anything. You can expect, this facet of creation to operate this way. You can expect vegetation to operate this way. You can expect to procreate this way to fulfill the creation mandate. So my point is, like, all those things are to be consistent. They're already laid out. a finished product that has ongoing results throughout the history of humans at large until God brings his creation to a close.
Mhm.
So nothing was ever supposed to be manipulated in such a way. That, as Eric said, that manipulation and mutation, that is a product of fallen mind and also fallen person as a whole.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Those are great points. Um, like I said, I just really wanted to spend some time on that phrase because it was really eye-opening. I'm guilty of glossing it over myself. So when I really decided to just start teaching from Genesis through Revelation and really dug into it, and I was just like, oh my goodness, this is I've been passing that over all this time, just kind of taking it for granted, but it has so much more meaning than what I originally thought. So I think it was just really good for us to discuss that, and I hope that those who listen are edified by it or challenged by it, depending on where they stand. Um, so let's get into day 4. Um,
Can I make a remark about you guys? Let me know if you agree with this.
Mhm.
When I was reading through the creation week, I saw that you have day 1, day 2, and day 3. And then we come to day 4. Day 4 kind of parallels day 1 because you have light, and then he organizes it and sets it to the luminaries. So he
Mhm.
kind of prepares for the luminaries. And then day 2, you have the sky and the seas, and then he fills that with on day 5 with the birds. Is it day 5 that he
Right. The,
with the
the
Yeah.
birds
sea creatures and the
and the
birds.
sea
Yeah.
creatures,
Yeah.
and then what we just talked about on day 3 with forming the dry land and the vegetation? He fills what he uh, brought to be on day 3 in day 6 with land animals and man.
Hmm.
So I just see that that connection there when I was reading. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, I definitely agree.
Oh yeah, we actually mentioned that
You
uh,
brought that up.
one of the
One
earlier
of them. Yeah.
podcasts. We actually
Okay.
talked about the feeling, how so God on the first 3 days he's dealing with the tohu part, the unformed
Mm-hmm.
part. He's forming the unformed, and then on days 4 through 6 he's dealing with the
He's filling
vocal
it.
part,
Yeah.
where he's filling the void, the the void part. So yeah, we kind of, I think that was the second episode, I think.
It's so brilliantly put together that even the way it's described.
Right,
You have
right.
Yeah.
light on day 1, day 4. You have the sun, the moon, and the stars, and
Yeah.
then day 2 you have waters and the sky, and he fills that on day 5 with birds and sea creatures, and then day 3 corresponds with day 6. So it's like a perfect parallel there.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
creation week is pretty remarkable how brilliant it's laid out in the first chapter. I
yeah.
like that. I like that order and consistency
Yeah.
and intelligent design that I see here. It makes sense to me, whereas evolution makes absolutely no sense, and it fails. It fails to tell us how things came to be.
Right, right,
And but here we have, so whether or not you have faith or not, it doesn't change the fact that this is the only historical um, answer to how things came to be.
mhm,
And so
Absolutely.
modernism had multiple meta narratives that postmodernism criticized, and they said there's no real meta narratives. There's only localized narratives or whatever. But there's only one overarching story to the history of the universe, and that begins and is explained as far as the origins here in Genesis chapter 1.
right, right. Now, so I want to read the next day, but then I have my mom actually made this observation, which I thought was kind of interesting. So I wanted to run it by you guys before we actually get into day 4. So in verse 14, he says, "Then God said, 'Let there be lights,' in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth and to govern the day and the night and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. And so before we get into day four, my mom asked the question. Well, she made the observation. She noticed that the first 3 days, it says that God called whatever it was what he called it. So it's like, and God called the dry land earth, and God called the waters the seas, and God called what else? God called the expanse heaven. So God is doing. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. So in the first 3 days, God is doing all this naming, but then when we get to days 4 through 6, He stops naming. Had you guys ever noticed that?
Yeah, not particularly. No, I haven't noticed. I hadn't noticed that.
Yeah, he does. He doesn't say anything about God calling the lights anything in
Well,
in
it's interesting when you get to day 6, though. What you're saying is he gets man to see what he's going to call the other.
Yeah, yeah. That's what I
right,
was. That's what I was gonna
right.
say. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you guys had ever noticed that. 'Cause
Nah, I had.
I
I
never
had. I
I
mean,
never noticed it.
yeah. I mean, I know. I know that. I mean, I knew that he gave man those creative abilities to begin naming what he would, what he, what he wanted to give names to. But I hadn't noticed. I
But
hadn't
was
noticed
that
that part.
was that was that naming that God gave Adam the authority to do? Was that specific only to the animals?
Do I think that Adam was only naming animals?
Right.
Well,
I would like to look at that.
I mean, yeah, you get the answer in
I know
um,
it's. Hold on.
chapter 2. It says, "Out of the ground, the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the sky, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. Whatever the
Yeah,
man called a living creature, that was its name. The
yeah,
Okay.
man gave names to all the cattle, and to the birds of the sky, and to every beast of the field."
yeah,
So that specifically, we know that in there for sure.
Right, right,
yeah.
right. But it's interesting here on day 4. It's like,
It might
well, you
it might
know,
have something to do with also that what we just talked about day 1 corresponding with day 4, day
mhm,
2 corresponding with day 5, and day 3 corresponding with day 6, as he's filling these different um, systems with that he created with that he prepared for the luminaries, and then he
mhm,
prepared for the birds and the different ecosystems for the birds and the fish and the
mhm.
sea creatures, and then the land animals and man. So that's
Yeah.
an interesting expositional observation.
Yeah, I mean, it was a blessing to me because, one of the things that we try to do uh, in our churches and on our podcast is to help people to be careful readers of the text.
Yeah, sure.
And so
Absolutely.
it was actually a blessing to me for my mom to mention. I had to go. I was like, wait, what?
Yeah,
And so I'm going through, and I'm like, oh wow, she's right. Well, how?
and
What?
yeah, it shows the depth too of what this. You can't blow through this chapter.
Right.
There's so much
No.
here. Yeah,
Right.
read
Right.
slowly and carefully, and
Yeah.
ask for the Lord's illumination.
Yeah. It was a blessing just to see people, see somebody benefiting from the stress that we make on being a careful reader of the text.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was just good. So we talk about these lights in the expanse of the heavens separate the day from the night, which corresponds with, as you said, day 1, Eric. Um, So there's a couple of views on the construction here. For it says, "Let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." One construction says that signs is the general word, and then seasons, days, and years is the specific signs that are being put under that category of signs. But then there's another construction that I saw where each one of these is a separate thing. And I just wanted to see what you guys' thoughts were on the function of these luminaries.
Yeah, I mean, so signs, signs are by definition, even just kind of looking at the Hebrew explanation, by definition, a sign always has an object that it's pointing to. And so a sign doesn't exist within itself. So, I would say that first you have the separation, and the signs are supposed to indicate something. And I believe that something is related to function. So the signs are supposed to mark off, seasons. They're supposed to mark off days and years. But even more specifically than that, knowing what we know about where this is going, it's supposed to mark off how Adam and Eve are to cultivate, the land before them. So, they're supposed to take advantage of the opportune times in order to cultivate to a lesser degree. When we talk about cultivate pre-fall versus post-fall, but I think that's very much in play. So I think, I certainly think, let them be for signs, and I think that signs is also related to God's redemptive plan in this way. I don't want to over spiritualize, but in this way, that God speaks to His people within time from an eternal perspective. So, when God speaks, there's supposed to be a recognition of the fulfillment of that which He's saying. So I don't think it's only related to the seasons, days, and years. I think it's related to the function of creation, but also the function of divine prophecy and everything related to the covenants. Like, I think we're moving in that direction because that's how God is speaking. He's speaking audibly and directly to His people at this point in the history of kind of the people of Israel coming to pass. So I think it very much has to do with both the function of creation and also the function of God's divine plan. So, and I think that's why signs is mentioned so often in Scripture. It's not only to mark off, time as something like aesthetically pleasing to the eye, but even that has a function. God says this and this is going to take place, and from one day to the next, there's an observation of His faithfulness related to that. But there's also, with respect to how things have an orderly, sequential, linear. We believe in linear history, moving from the beginning, from temporal standpoint, to the middle, to the end. So I think that's in play as well.
Anything, Eric?
Yeah, these luminaries, to just segue from what Duran was talking about, they have authority. They're governing the way things are as He organizes this here on day 4. So I see, boundaries, and you can only go this far, and the purpose also as it's tied into man having a habitation to dwell in, having the sun, the moon, the stars, and organizing light, and their purpose and their authority to govern. And just you see God's purpose for everything that He does, and it just makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
I noticed here in verse 16, we talk about the functions. It says God made the 2 great lights, greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. And then it just kind of says He made the stars also.
Yeah.
So, so are the stars part of that form and function that you guys were talking about, with the signs and the seasons, the days and the years,
Yeah,
and
I think so.
and the governing aspect?
Yeah, I think so. But it's interesting. It's almost like it's not a footnote, but it's kind of like you look up at the heavens, look up in outer space telescope, and the stars are just mind blowing. I mean, how remarkable they are. It's kind of like, and then he made the stars also. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of like, yeah, he made the stars too.
Yeah,
When I
I don't.
when I read it, it kind of just comes off that way. It's like, yeah, he made this great light, he made this less light, and yeah, he made stars too.
But they certainly have a purpose, and you see that purpose for them now in nautical navigation.
I was gonna say that. Yeah,
is a major, like, especially now, or I would say, like, since man has been traveling the seas, and you also have, I think, evidence of a globe and not a flat Earth when we're talking about the luminaries and specifically the stars. And as the seasons change, there you see them in different positions and locations.
Right.
So I think that's significant. Also, in my opinion, I don't believe the Earth is flat. I think we live in a perforated sphere, and so the stars argue that perforated sphere view of the topography of the Earth.
yeah, and I think, and I agree with all of that. And I believe that what's said the way it is because the stars and the luminaries, they do not have this like divine authority to govern or to interpret people's existence and lives. So, so they're given some airtime in terms that they were created, but you're told the source creates them, and we don't go beyond utilizing them to in any way manipulate or try to interpret man's existence solely through the luminaries, like you would have in
Yes,
astrology and the
exactly.
mystic arts, and all the things that would be prohibited in Deuteronomy. I mean, you'll see that in Deuteronomy, I think certain things are said in Leviticus that prohibit the use, and then you have ancient Egypt. By the time we reach the Exodus, they're utilizing the luminaries in this manipulative way. So I think they're given, certainly God is credited with creating them, but they do not stand over God. And I believe that that's the distinction as to how we would view, them as signs versus how those who would worship the stars or utilize them as an divine and interpretive authority.
It's also interesting to note because and this is why the NET notes are very helpful because they give you just enough. They're not like really fully explaining stuff. They're like giving you just enough to help you. But at the time that Moses was writing this, there were Hebrew words for sun and moon. But instead of using the term sun and moon, he just calls them a greater light and a lesser light. And the NET poses the point that this was to um, affirm that these were just created entities and not deities, because
Yes.
apparently during the time when Moses was writing this, the word, but what are the words? Shemesh and Yari, they were probably used as names of gods, like the god of the sun and the god of the moon.
Yeah,
And
that's a
so
good point.
so they argue here that Moses is avoiding
Yeah, sure.
using those terms
I
so
agree.
that, yeah, I thought that was very interesting.
I mean,
And
this
And it,
Chris, you. Oh yeah, go
yeah,
ahead,
go
yeah,
ahead.
Eric. Go ahead.
This isn't completely analogous, but you know how, like, you have man puts a governor, in his automobile to limit the speed that it can go,
mhm,
and
Mm-hmm.
so these are, in a sense, God. It's not completely analogous, but he's putting a governor on these luminaries that they,
Yeah,
and the limits to what they're constrained to, and so that would also presuppose that the it's God's authority over these luminaries, and so
absolutely.
certainly people today and astrology and all that stuff, they worship the sun, the moon, and the stars, and man has been as an idolater. John Calvin said the human heart is an idol factory, and so
mhm.
you look all around you and you look up at the man in his idolatrous state has taken the sun, the moon, and the stars and worshipped them, and
Right,
they
right,
have some kind of like what Duran said. I agree. Like, they don't have this divine authority of themselves. They're like governors.
right.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think Chris, you had mentioned it at the very beginning. I think we were talking about Genesis as a polemic. So
Mhm,
Genesis as a
mhm.
polemic, and I agree. I agree strongly. I don't think it's a forced polemic, but I think it's certainly polemical. Like I think it is a fight to explain the one and only exclusive, orderly, divine, and historical account from the one and only true historical God who stands over all things. So I really think that's the approach that Moses is taking. So even if you were to explain something exclusive versus a very pluralistic society, what you're saying is going to rightly so take shots at that pluralism, and I think you'll see that all throughout the Pentateuch. I mean, it's in all the five books of Moses that takes place. The luminaries and the explanation of that, and it's no different. I think it's embedded in the text because of, like you said, Chris, historically what's happening around, uh, in the ancient Near East, pre-ancient Near East society at that time.
Now, I think it's also important to note in verse 17 that God is active here.
Yeah,
'Cause it says
Mhm.
God placed them.
Mm.
yeah,
Mhm.
God placed the sun where he wanted the sun to be, and he placed the moon where he wanted, and he placed the stars where he wanted them. I think that's another thing that's very important to note.
yep,
So that we see the power and the activity of God in creation. He's not a passive bystander standing off to the side and hoping and wishing that things just kind of go the way he wants them to go, but he is actively involved in this creation of the heavens and the earth. So I think that's also important to note.
yeah.
Um,
That's awesome.
yeah,
And
and then
he just didn't set it in motion, um,
Right.
and it's not coming from random chance process, like you said, just standing by and watching it happen. He's literally and intimately involved in the whole process.
right, right.
Absolutely.
Uh, last thing, can you guys, in verse 18, you guys were talking. I know you've already mentioned the governing, but can you kind of expound on that a little bit more? What is it? What does it mean for the sun to rule or govern the day, and what does it mean for the moon to govern the night?
I think as a sense of putting a limit and boundaries upon daytime and nighttime. The whole dualism. Um, I think of this as good versus evil, though. I don't think is I don't think has any merit from the text here, because we're talking about physical light and physical darkness, and I think governing them, organizing them, and putting limits and boundaries upon what is an actual um, solar day and the features of a solar day. Remember, for the Hebrew, he's understanding this as the day beginning at evening time, not in the morning when the sun
Mhm.
rises too.
Right, right.
And so that follows the flow of the text here.
Yeah, we talked about the time of, because they said he says evening and morning instead of
Mhm.
morning and evening.
Right.
So we established second episode that he is using the Jewish reckoning of time, which starts in the evening and it goes to the morning. So yeah, it's
And both in this sense, before the fall, before Genesis 3, there's wonder and it's something special and enjoyable in the daytime as well as the evening is enjoyable. The evening time, you know,
yeah.
or
I
I
mean,
should say the
Absolutely.
nighttime and then the daytime.
yeah,
Mhm.
I look forward to finally one day seeing creation as it was meant to be.
Yeah,
Possibly seeing colors you've never seen before, and when we talked about the size and shape of things, and
Yeah.
finally getting to see the new heavens and the new earth and seeing it in its perfection
yeah.
and being able to
Yeah.
truly appreciate all of that, even
Well,
though
how
we can
amazing that
still
is.
appreciate creation in post fall,
Yeah.
but to see it in its perfection pre-fall once again, that's I'm looking forward to that day.
Yeah, I mean, this is before the creation is groaning, so
Right.
the picture of even the luminaries, even the Genesis 1 chapter 18, this governance, it has the idea of like it's placed in a certain dominion, and that's not to say its dominion is over God, but because it's absolutely not. But I mean, it's this long-standing feature that will consistently mark off time and pointing you to the source of its creation.
Yeah,
And so,
that's a good point that you're bringing up, because I think it does give meaning to governing, as far as being able to mark off
mhm,
and to
mhm,
count the days, the seasons, and the
mhm,
years when he has these
mhm,
luminaries, so you can get a calendar out and you can track and mark off the succession of moments
yep,
in time. So I
yep,
appreciate you bringing it up, because that just came back to me when you were saying that. I just was thinking about that. Is
yeah,
to mark and record the succession of moments in time.
yes,
100%.
absolutely.
All right. I think we covered 2 days. So I think we can use this as a good stopping point. And then the next time we meet, we'll get into days 5 and 6. I hope that you all who are listening to the podcast are being edified and challenged by it. It's actually causing you to search the scriptures more, study the scriptures more, become even more careful readers of the text, see the things that you've been missing. Because, like I told you earlier, you're guilty, as I have been, of glossing over the text and kind of passing over certain phrases because you're taking it for granted. So it just means this, and when some of these things actually have a more fuller and more richer meaning. So hopefully, through the efforts that we put forth in this podcast to explain the text, that's helping you to become a better and a more careful student of the scriptures. So we thank you guys for your support, and we'll get into day 5 and day 6 next week, or the next time we meet. And so you guys have yourselves a great week, and whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. And we'll see you next time.